The plain of jars is a megalithic archaeological landscape in Laos. It consists of thousands of stone jars scattered around the upland valleys and the lower foothills of the central plain of the Xiangkhoang Plateau. The jars are mostly arranged in clusters ranging in number from 1 to several hundred. The Xieng Khouang Plateau is located at the northern end of the Annamese Cordillera, the principal mountain range of Indochina. French researcher Madeleine Kalani concluded in 1930 that the jars were associated with prehistoric burial practices. Excavation by Lao and Japanese archaeologists in the intervening years has supported this interpretation with the discovery of human remains, burial goods and ceramics around the jars. The plain of jars is dated to the Iron Age and is one of the most important prehistoric sites in Southeast Asia. The jar sites. More than 90 jar sites have been identified within Xiangkhoang province. Each site has from 1 to 400 stone jars. The jars vary in height and diameter between 1 meter and 3 meters and are all hewn from rock. The shape is cylindrical with the bottom always wider than the top. The stone jars are undecorated with the exception of a single jar at site 1. This jar has a human, frogman, bas-relief carved on the exterior. Parallels between the frogman and the rock painting at Huashan in Guangxi, China have been drawn. The Chinese paintings, which depict large full frontal images of humans with arms raised and knees bent, are dated to 500 BC to 200 AD. Since most of the jars have lip rims, it is thought that the jars originally supported lids. Although few stone lids have been recorded, this may suggest that the bulk of lids were fashioned from perishable materials. Stone lids with animal carvings have been found at few sites such as Ban Phakio. The bas-relief carvings are thought to depict monkeys, tigers and frogs. No in situ lid has ever been found. Stone discs have also been found. The discs, which differ from the lids, have at least one flat side and a grave markers which were placed on the surface to cover a marker burial pit. These grave markers appear more infrequently than jars, but are found in close proximity. Similar are stoned grave markers. These stones are unworked, but have been placed intentionally to mark a grave. To the north of Xieng Khouang, an extensive network of intentionally placed largely unworked stones marking elaborate burial pits and chambers are known as standing stones of Wifan. These have been dated to the Bronze Age. The jars lie in clusters on the lower foot slopes and mountain ridges of the hills surrounding the central plateau and upland valleys. Several quarry sites have been recorded, usually close to the jar sites. 5 rock types have been identified: sandstone, granite, conglomerate, limestone and breccia. The majority of the jars are sandstone. It is assumed that plain of jars people used iron chisels to manufacture the jars, although no conclusive evidence for this exists. Regional differences in jar shape have been noted. While the differences in most cases can be attributed to choice and manipulation of rock source, some differences in form appear to be unique to specific sites. A cave located at Site 1 is a natural limestone formation with an opening to the northwest and 2 man-made holes at the top. These holes are thought to be chimneys for a crematorium. French geologist and amateur archaeologist Madeleine Kalani excavated inside the cave in the early 1930s and found material to support a crematorium theory. Kalani also recorded and excavated a 12 plain of jars sites and published 2 volumes with her findings in 1935. Kalani concluded that the plain of jars was an Iron Age burial site. Inside the jars she found, embedded in black organic soil, colored glass beads, burned teeth and bone fragments, sometimes from more than one individual. Around the stone jars, she found human bones, pottery fragments, iron and bronze objects, glass and stone beads, ceramic weights and charcoal. The bone and teeth inside the jars show signs of cremation, while the burials surrounding the jars yield unburned secondary burial bones. No further archaeological research was conducted until November 1994, when Professor Ajinita of the Kagoshima University and now archaeologist Thongsa Xiangkhoang Plateau surveyed and mapped Site 1. Nita claimed that the surrounding burial pits were contemporaneous to the jars, as they had been cut into the surface on which the jars had been placed. Nita believed the jars were symbolic monument to mark the surrounding burials. He dated the plain of jars to the late 2nd or early 1st millennium BC based on the burial urn and associated grave goods. Xiangkhoang Plateau undertook surveys and excavations between 1994 and 1996, supported by the Australian National University. Xiangkhoang Plateau and Peter Bellwood interpreted the stone jars as a central person's primary or secondary burial, surrounded by secondary burials of family members. Archaeological data collected during bomb clearance operations supervised by UNESCO archaeologist Julie van den Berg in 2004-2005 and again in 2007, provided similar archaeological results. Like Nita, van den Berg concluded that the jars and surrounding burials were contemporaneous. Variations in the practices of cremation inside jars and secondary burial outside jars, as noted by Kalani, have proven difficult to explain. The cremated remains seem to mainly belong to adolescents, while the bomb clearance operations did not involve emptying of jars and thus no additional evidence could be gathered. The van den Berg claimed that the stone jars initially may have been used to distill the dead bodies and that the cremated remains within the jars represent the most recent phase in plane of jars. The jars with smaller apertures may reflect the diminishing need to place an entire body inside. The suggestion that the jars, in a similar fashion to traditional Southeast Asian royal mortuary practices, functioned as distilling vessels, was put forward by R. Engelhardt and P. Rogers in 2001. In contemporary funerary practices followed by Thai, Cambodian and Laotian royalty, the corpse of the deceased is placed into an urn during the early stages of the funeral rites, at which time the soul of deceased is believed to be undergoing gradual transformation from the earthly to the spiritual world. The ritual decomposition is later followed by cremation and secondary burial. Incidentally, the megalithic Dravidians of South India used giant burial urns called Madhu Makaltaji or Emathaji. These funerary urns were buried with the bodies of the deceased as soon to die in a sitting posture, along with the personal goods and ornaments. This practice was in vogue until 200 AD. The royal burials are located across watercourses from the habitation areas in a geographically high, prominent area. Among the black Thai people who have been in the region at least since the 11th century, the upper classes are cremated in the belief that it will release the spirits to heaven, while commoners are buried, leaving the spirits to remain on earth. Kalani connected the location of the jars sites to ancient trade routes, in particular with the salt trade. She assumed that salt was a commodity sought after by the plain of jars people, which brought traders to the Xiangkhoang Plateau. The Xiangkhoang area is rich in metallic minerals, mainly due to granite intrusions and associated hydrothermal activity. Two principal iron ore deposits exist in Laos, both in Xiangkhoang. The presence and locations of the numerous jar sites in Xiangkhoang may relate to trading and mining activities. History has shown that Xiangkhoang, at the northern end of the Annamese Range, provides relative ease easy passage from the north and east to the south and west. Within the geographic setting of Xiangkhoang, the Jia sites may reflect a network of intercultural villages, whereby the locations of the Jias are associated with long-distance overland routes which connect the Mekong Basin and the Gulf of Tonkin system. The Jia sites show superficial regional differences, such as Jia form, material, and the number of Jias per site, but all share common setting characteristics such as burial practices, elevated locations, and commanding views over the surrounding area. The most investigated and visited Jia site is located close to the town of Phonsavan, and is known as Site 1. 7 Jia sites have now been cleared of unexploded bombs and are open to visitors. These are currently Sites 1, 2 and 3, and Site 16 near the old capital Xiangkhoang, Site 23, near the Big Hot Spring in Muyang Kham, Site 25 in the largely unvisited Phokat district, and Site 52, the largest known Jia site to date, with 392 Jias near a traditional Hmong village only accessible by foot. Legends and local history. Lao legends tell of a race of giants who inhabited the area and who were ruled by a king named Kun Chung, who fought a long and ultimately victorious battle against an enemy. He supposedly created the Jias to brew and store huge amounts of Lao Hai to celebrate his victory. Another local story states that the Jias were molded from natural materials including clay, sand, sugar, and animal products in a type of stone mix. This led the locals to believe the cave at Site 1 was actually a kiln, and that the Jias were fired there and are not actually hewn from stone. Another suggested explanation for the Jias' use is to collect monsoon rainwater for caravan travelers along the journey at times when rain may have been seasonal and water was not readily available on the easiest footpaths. Rainwater would then be boiled, even if stagnant, to become potable again, a practice long understood in Eastern Eurasia. The trade caravans that camped around these Jias could have placed beads inside them as offerings, accompanying prayers for rain, or the beads might simply have been unassociated lost items. Current situation. Between 1964 and 1973, the plain of Jias was heavily bombed by the U.S. Air Force operating against North Vietnamese and Pathet Lao Communist forces. The U.S. Air Force dropped more bombs on Laos, primarily the plain of Jias, than it dropped during the whole of World War II. This included 262 million anti-personnel cluster bombs. An estimated 80 million of these did not explode and remain a deadly threat to the population. A large quantity of unexploded bombs in the area, especially cluster munitions, limits free movement. Evidence of the bombing raids can be seen in the form of broken or displaced Jias and bomb craters. Sightseeing on the plain of Jias can only be done safely on cleared and marked pathways. The Mines Advisory Group, a non-governmental organization, in collaboration with UNESCO and funded by the New Zealand government, cleared unexploded bombs from the 3 most visited sites from July 2004 until July 2005. A second phase of bomb clearance at the sites, also funded by NZAID, was undertaken in 2007. 4 more Jia sites were made safe. The Laos.It government and NZAID built a visitors center that was opened on 13 August 2013 at the plain of Jias Site 1. It is at the bottom of a hill 200 meters before a car park. The center provides English language information panels on the history of the plain of Jias culture, as well as its modern history during the 1964 to 1975 conflict. The Laos.It government is considering applying for status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site for the plain of Jias. The Lao UNESCO program for safeguarding the plain of Jias has been an ongoing effort by UNESCO in the Lao government to document and rehabilitate the plain of jars. Clearing the remaining bomb hazards must be done before the sites can be further studied and developed for tourism. One of the main objectives is community-based involvement in the management and conservation of the jar sites, which has been largely successful. However, tourism at the most visited sites has resulted in damage to some of the jars.